They mocked the Americans, laughed at the men freezing inside Bastogne, convinced the U.S. Army would collapse in the snow. But only hours later, they realized they had awakened the one general, capable of turning disaster into destiny. This is the winter the Germans should never have laughed at. The Ardennes Forest in December 1944 did not merely feel cold. It felt ancient, cruel, and alive. The wind cut through uniforms like knives, and the darkness pressed against the trees like something, waiting to devour anything foolish enough to wander too far. Snow covered the rolling hills and narrow roads in a deep, suffocating silence, a silence broken only by distant artillery or the groaning of pine branches weighed down by frost. For months, the Allied command believed the German army was broken. Hitler's forces had been pushed back through France, driven across Belgium, and were losing ground on both the eastern and western fronts. American soldiers wrote letters home saying they would likely be back in the States by spring. Officers openly predicted the war would be finished by early 1945. Christmas, they said, would be quiet. They were disastrously wrong. Behind the walls of the Führer's headquarters, Adolf Hitler prepared one last throw of the dice, a masterstroke he believed that would change the fate of the war. The plan, called Operation Wacht am Rhein, aimed to do what even the German High Command considered impossible: smash through the thin American lines in the Ardennes, rush across Belgium, seize Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in half. If executed perfectly, the Allies would be forced into a negotiated peace. If it failed, Germany's defeat would only come sooner. But Hitler had never feared impossible odds. And so, under the cloak of the harshest European winter in decades, he gathered 29 divisions, 250,000 soldiers, and over 1,000 tanks, including the feared Tiger II and Panther. They moved only at night, refrained from radio communication, and used the deep forest as concealment. Their preparations were so precise, so silent, that even Allied intelligence, usually sharp, sometimes prophetic, noticed nothing. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the forest erupted. At 5:30 a.m., German artillery screamed across the sky and shattered the American positions along an 80-mile front. Barrages of high-explosive shells turned snowy fields into fountains of earth and smoke. In the eerie pre-dawn glow, thousands of German infantry surged forward, their silhouettes flickering against flames rising from shattered American outposts. For the U.S. soldiers manning the thin defensive lines, many young, many inexperienced, their first moments of combat were chaos. Veterans of Normandy and the breakout at St. Lo remembered the German assault as a storm made of steel. Communications lines were severed. Entire platoons vanished in minutes. Frostbitten roads clogged with retreating vehicles and wounded men. The Americans were not cowards. They were simply overwhelmed. In the heart of the Ardennes lay the crossroads town of Bastogne, a small Belgian community that few had heard of before the offensive. But to any strategist reading a map, Bastogne was a jewel. Every major road in the region converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire southern approach to Antwerp. Hitler knew it. His generals knew it. And so did the Americans. But they were running out of time. Within 48 hours, German armored columns encircled Bastogne, cutting it off completely. Inside were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by tank destroyers, artillery units, and desperate stragglers from shattered infantry regiments. They dug foxholes in frozen ground so hard their entrenching tools snapped. They fought with limited rations, dwindling ammunition, and no winter clothing. When German officers approached under a white flag on December 22 to demand their surrender, the American acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word: nuts. It was a defiant, almost humorous answer in the face of annihilation, an answer that would become legendary. But defiance didn't change reality. The 101st was surrounded by thousands of German troops. No supplies could get through. Weather made airdrops almost impossible. And the cold was killing men, faster than bullets. From Berlin to every German command post along the front, laughter echoed. They mocked the Americans trapped in Bastogne. They mocked the green U.S. divisions that had collapsed during the initial assault. They mocked the so-called American fighting spirit. To many German officers, this was proof that the United States was soft, untested, spoiled by industrial abundance but lacking true warriors. Recordings captured German propagandists saying, "Let the Americans freeze. They will not need bullets where they are going." But beneath the dark canopy of fir trees, in the heart of that frozen hell, something else was happening. Although surrounded, the 101st fought with iron determination. They repelled assault after assault from German tanks and infantry. Their wounded lay in makeshift aid stations, treated by medics wearing gloves frozen stiff with blood. Officers huddled around maps lit by trembling candlelight. Exhausted soldiers shared cigarettes with numb fingers. Some prayed, some cursed. All held the line. Yet everyone knew Bastogne could not hold forever. And somewhere far to the south, more than 100 miles away, another character waited in the wings. A man whose personality burned hotter than the fires of the front. A commander as controversial as he was brilliant. A leader the Germans both feared and respected more than any other Allied general. His name was Lieutenant General George S. Patton. He had already sensed something was amiss days before the German attack. His intelligence staff reported unusual troop movements. Patton, always preparing for the unexpected, ordered 3 separate contingency plans for a rapid pivot north if required, while others dismissed the possibility of a German offensive. Patton sharpened his focus. And now, as Bastogne bled and the Ardennes reeled under the German onslaught, the moment he had foreseen, the moment he had trained for his entire life, was calling. The German mockery grew louder. Their confidence swelled. The world believed the American line might crumble. But Patton was already rising from his chair, ready to march into the storm. The Germans laughed at the Americans trapped in Bastogne. But they had forgotten about the man who would soon drag an entire army across frozen Europe to collide with their offensive like a hammer, swung by destiny itself. And the winter of 1944, unforgiving and merciless, was about to witness one of the greatest military turnarounds in history. In the early hours of December 19, 1944, a cold fog hung over the headquarters at Verdun. Generals, aides, and staff officers moved quickly through dimly lit corridors, their breath visible in the freezing air. Rumors flew between rooms. Some said the Germans had broken through the lines. Others claimed entire American divisions had evaporated in the Ardennes. No one knew for sure. No one, except perhaps one man, seemed entirely calm. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., stood near a long wooden table in the conference room, his polished helmet tucked under one arm. He wore his signature leather coat, the one that had become almost as iconic as the man himself. His eyes, piercing and full of restless energy, scanned the map of Europe pinned to the wall. The German advance bulged westward like an angry fist. To the others in the room, Patton was a paradox. A brilliant mind wrapped in an unpredictable personality. He was brash, foul-mouthed, aggressive, and unapologetically ambitious. Yet beneath that tempestuous exterior lay one of the sharpest strategic intellects of the Second World War. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. Eisenhower was calm, diplomatic, and measured, the antithesis of Patton's blunt fury. But even he knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. The meeting began. Maps were unfurled. Reports were read aloud. German armored spearheads were cutting deep into U.S. territory. Communications from Bastogne had turned frantic. The 28th Infantry Division was shattered. The 106th had been nearly wiped out. Roads were jammed with refugees and retreating soldiers. Winter weather grounded Allied aircraft, leaving the skies in German hands. The room, filled with some of the most experienced military minds in the world, seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Eisenhower placed both hands on the table. "Gentlemen," he said gravely, "the Germans have achieved a breakthrough. We must organize a counterattack immediately." "Courtney," he said, turning to General Hodges of the First Army, "how soon can you mount an offensive to relieve Bastogne?" Hodges hesitated, flipping through notes. 3, maybe 4 days, sir." "Too late," Eisenhower muttered. He turned toward another. "General Omar, what about you?" General Omar Bradley, calm, analytical, and dependable, shook his head. "Our positions are too fragmented. We need time to reorganize." Time was precisely the one thing they didn't have. Eisenhower's gaze finally fell on Patton, who had been silently studying the map, fingers tapping the edge of the table. "George," Eisenhower asked, "how long would it take you to disengage your Third Army and turn north to attack into the flank of the German penetration?" The room went quiet. No one expected much. Patton's army was in the middle of its own offensive, knee-deep in fighting around the Saar River. To disengage, reorient, and redeploy an entire army, 6 divisions, would take at least a week, perhaps more. But Patton didn't blink. "Sir," he replied, his voice sharp and unwavering, "I can move in 48 hours. Several staff officers nearly dropped their pencils. Bradley stared at Patton as if he had misheard. Eisenhower raised an eyebrow. 48 hours? "Yes, sir," Patton said. "I already have 3 contingency plans prepared. All I need is your approval." That was the difference between Patton and everyone else in the room. While the other generals were reacting to the German offensive, Patton had anticipated it. He wasn't merely confident. He was ready. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, struck by the audacity of the proposal. "You're serious. Dead serious, Ike." For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. One calm and diplomatic, the other ferocious and electric. Eisenhower exhaled slowly. "Very well, George. Do it." Patton smiled, a thin, wolfish grin. "Yes, sir." He saluted sharply, spun on his heel, and strode out of the room with the urgency of a man who had already begun fighting a battle no one else could see. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets, turning the roads slick and dangerous. Patton climbed into his command jeep, engine sputtering against the cold. His driver glanced back, awaiting orders. "Headquarters," Patton barked. "Step on it." When he arrived, his senior staff gathered quickly. Some looked exhausted, others confused. Everyone sensed the storm that was about to break. Patton stood before them, shoulders squared. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we are turning the entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north, effective immediately." Shock rippled through the room. "Sir, an entire army? In this weather?" Our divisions are still engaged with the enemy. Roads are frozen solid. Patton slammed his fist onto the table. I don't give a damn about the roads, he thundered. Our boys are surrounded at Bastogne. We are going to break through to them, and we are going to do it now. He pointed at each officer in turn, his voice like a whip. Tell your men this is not just another maneuver. This is history calling. He paused, then delivered the words that would ignite one of the greatest troop movements in modern warfare. Play ball. 2 simple words. But to the staff officers who had rehearsed Patton's contingency plans for days, it meant the machine was switching on. It meant convoys would roll, tanks would rumble, rifles would be cleaned, and engines would roar across the icy countryside. It meant a race against time. Patton's staff saluted and scattered like sparks from a forge. Within hours, the Third Army began to turn north, divisions pivoting in synchronized, disciplined movements. Thousands of vehicles poured onto the roads, creating steel rivers that stretched beyond the horizon. Officers shouted orders through icy wind. Mechanics worked with frozen fingers. Soldiers packed gear in the dark. Engines coughed, sputtered, and finally growled to life. Patton walked among them, boots crunching on snow, coat flapping behind him like the wings of a raven. He shouted encouragement to a group of shivering infantrymen. Boys, he said loudly, if you think the Germans are going to stop us, you're mistaken. They're going to be sorry they ever started this. A nearby soldier, no older than 19, stared at him in awe. Patton's presence wasn't warm, but it was powerful. It made men believe they could accomplish miracles. As Patton looked northward, toward the burning Ardennes, toward the encircled troops at Bastogne, a fierce determination flashed across his eyes. He had always believed he was born for a moment like this, a moment when courage and audacity could change the course of history. And now, as the winter wind howled and his army rumbled into motion, he felt destiny rising to meet him. The Germans were laughing at the Americans trapped in Bastogne. But their laughter would not last long. Patton was coming. The Third Army moved like a great beast awakening in the dead of winter. Slow at first, groaning, shaking off the stiffness of cold metal and colder men, and then gathering speed as if powered by sheer determination. What German offensive at the height of its momentum. The roads were barely roads at all. Snowdrifts towered over the shoulders. Ice sheets turned every bend into a death trap, and fog clung to the ground, so thickly that headlights became useless halos in the white void. Yet the columns kept moving, infantry trucks, armored cars, jeeps, M7 Priest artillery vehicles, and the iconic M4 Sherman tanks, each one a growling furnace of steel pushing north. To the soldiers within those machines, the journey felt endless. Engines backfired. Tracks snapped. Men cursed, coughed, shivered, and then laughed because the alternative was to freeze. The cold swallowed sound, muffling everything except the deep, rhythmic rumble of thousands of vehicles crawling across France and Luxembourg. Patton drove through the chaos in his open-top Jeep, refusing the protection of an enclosed vehicle. Snow collected on his leather coat and helmet. His face was red from windburn and frost, but he showed no discomfort. He seemed, in some impossible way, invigorated by the misery around him. "Keep moving!" he shouted at a stalled artillery crew as he passed. "If the Krauts can march in this weather, so can you," a sergeant muttered to his gun crew. If he wasn't the one giving orders, I'd swear the bastard was crazy. But they moved faster because of him. By the morning of December 21st, the Vanguard Divisions, the 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division were closing in on their assault positions. Reports from Bastogne had grown, increasingly desperate. Ammunition was low. Medical supplies were nearly gone. The wounded lay wrapped in blankets, teeth chattering, waiting for salvation that might never come. German forces around the town tightened their grip. Panzers prowled the outskirts like wolves, probing defenses, firing shells into buildings that offered even the faintest sign of resistance. Infantry with white, camouflage snowsuits crept through the woods, the perfect hunters in a world turned white. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne dug deeper. They fought off attacks in Noville, Foy, Marvy, and Racon. Every victory cost them blood that froze on their gloves, fingers blackened with frostbite, and exhaustion that clung to them like chains. Yet despite the siege, their morale held. Each day they repeated the same phrase, "Patton's coming." But the Germans were not idle. They watched the skies, listened to intercepted chatter, and sensed the gathering storm to their south. German commanders had expected resistance, but not a full U.S. Army barreling toward them through the worst winter in living memory. General Erich Brandenberger, facing Patton's sector, told his officers, "The Americans will not reach Bastogne before we take it. They cannot move that fast. Not in this weather." He was wrong. The Third Army attacked on the morning of December 22nd, their guns thundering in unison. The bombardment shook the frozen earth and sent tremors through the German lines. Snow kicked up in violent plumes as shells erupted along ridges and crossroads. The air tasted of gunpowder and burning pine. Infantry advanced through snow up to their knees, fighting for every patch of ground. Machine guns rattled. Mortars whistled overhead. German snipers, invisible against the white landscape, picked off men as they trudged forward. The American advance looked painfully slow from afar, but in reality, it was a brutal grind through terrain that punished every step. At the spear point of the assault was Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel Wendell Blanchard. Their objective, carve a path straight to Bastogne. Blanchard's tanks roared through open fields, engines straining against freezing fuel lines. Sherman tanks traded fire with Panthers in a deadly duel across icy farmland. The Panthers had thicker armor and a more powerful gun, but the Shermans were faster, more maneuverable, and supported by aggressive American infantry who refused to yield. In the village of Bougainville, one of the division's tank battalions encountered a formidable German roadblock. Panther tanks lurked behind stone walls. Anti-tank guns covered the approach. It looked like a fortress made of fire and steel. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion, studied the enemy lines through his periscope and muttered, "Well, hell, let's go." His tanks charged forward, guns blazing. A Panther fired first, its shell striking the glacis of a Sherman and blowing it apart in a thunderous fireball. The shockwave rippled through the formation, but the others pressed on. Sherman zigzagged, firing on the move, flanking the heavier German tanks and peppering them with armor-piercing rounds. Infantry followed behind, sprinting across open snow, tossing grenades into foxholes, pulling German soldiers out of frozen barns. Gunfire echoed through the shattered village for hours until, finally, the stars and stripes rose over the ruins. But there was no time to celebrate. Bastogne was still miles away. The following day brought sleet and smoke. American forces punched deeper into the German flank. Patton visited frontline command posts, his boots caked with mud and snow. Officers briefed him on casualties and repositioning. He listened, nodded, and then growled the same thing each time. "Push harder." When a colonel listed the obstacles. Ahead, mines, entrenched infantry, a battalion of Mark IVs. Patton cut him off. Son, the only obstacle between us and Bastogne is our own hesitation. By Christmas Eve, the sound of artillery could be heard inside Bastogne. The men of the 101st Airborne sat in ruined buildings, listening to the distant thunder. Hope flickered like a match in the dark. The Germans heard it too, and their laughter faded. December 26th arrived with a sky the color of lead. Bulge and the 37th Tank Battalion spearheaded the final assault toward the town of Ardennes, the gateway to Bastogne. German resistance was fierce. Anti-tank teams with Panzerfausts emerged from ditches and hedges. Machine gun nests spat fire across open fields. But the 37th kept moving, battering through everything in their path. In the late afternoon, Bulge's Sherman named Cobra King surged over a ridge and down a snowy road. Ahead, American paratroopers in dirty, torn uniforms emerged from the treeline, waving frantically. Bulge leaned out of his turret and shouted, "Are you the 101st?" Paratrooper grinned back. "You're damn right we are." Bastogne had been relieved, and with that meeting, in the snow, the myth of Patton's unstoppable march became reality. But the battle was far from over. The Bulge still bulged, and the Germans would not surrender their final gamble so easily. The Third Army had broken the ring. Now they would have to crush the German offensive entirely. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the struggle. It was merely the first crack in Hitler's final gamble. The German offensive, once so terrifying in its momentum, still bulged across Belgium. Like a swollen wound, their armored spearheads remained dangerous, their infantry stubborn, and their supply lines strained but not yet broken. If the Allies hesitated, the Germans might still exploit the chaos they had created. But General George S. Patton had no intention of hesitating. The Third Army pressed forward relentlessly, its momentum fueled by the triumph at Bastogne. Fresh snow fell across the Ardennes, coating destroyed tanks, shattered trees, and the bodies of soldiers frozen where they had fought. The winter of 1944 was unkind to the living and merciless to the dead. Across the front, Allied units regrouped. Morale surged. If Bastogne had fallen, the psychological blow might have crippled American resolve. But it had not. Instead, the successful relief inspired confidence across the Western Front. Soldiers whispered Patton's name with a mixture of awe and gratitude, whether they served in his army or not. Still, the Germans were far from finished. In the north, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt urged caution. Field Marshal Walter Model called for withdrawal. But Hitler, stubborn and increasingly delusional, demanded the offensive continue. His vision of splitting the Allies and capturing Antwerp had already dissolved into fantasy. Fuel shortages, logistical collapse, and fierce American resistance made it impossible. Yet he refused to admit defeat. To force a change in momentum, German forces launched renewed assaults near Mannheim, Sankt Vith, and along the Somme River. They struck like a wounded predator, knowing each attack drained precious reserves but hoping to break American morale before their window closed forever. American soldiers, hardened by weeks in the snow, fought back savagely. Patton's Third Army slammed into the southern flank of the German salient while the 1st and 9th Armies pressed from the north. The Allies were beginning to squeeze the Bulge from both sides, like a vice tightening with each passing hour. But progress was brutal and slow. The terrain around the Ardennes became a frozen battleground of rotting forests, iced-over rivers, and villages reduced to nothing but chimneys, protruding from piles of rubble. Every hill, every crossroads, every farmhouse became a prize worth killing for. American Sherman tanks battled German panzers at ranges so close their barrels nearly touched. Artillery thundered day and night, the blasts echoing off the snowy hills. Soldiers fought not only the enemy but the cold, which seeped into boots and bones until men could no longer feel their own feet. Frostbite filled aid stations as quickly as shrapnel wounds. The Germans suffered even more. They were running out of fuel, literally. Entire tank units were abandoned on the roadside, their crews reduced to infantry. Field kitchens failed. Horses died in their tracks. Ammunition wagons froze to the ground. Yet they fought with a grim determination born of desperation. On January 1, 1945, the Germans launched Operation Bodenplatte, an attempt to destroy Allied air power across Western Europe. At dawn, hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft streaked across the sky, a last gasp of the once invincible German Air Force. They attacked airfields in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, causing significant damage. But it cost them everything. More than 200 fighters were shot down, pilots lost that Germany could not replace. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective force. And once the skies cleared above the Ardennes, American and British aircraft returned. With vengeance, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons swarmed above the Bulge. They attacked German convoys, tanks, and supply depots with rockets, bombs, and strafing runs that tore long black scars. Across the snow, trucks burned by the dozens. Ammunition wagons exploded in fiery columns. German soldiers were forced to march at night, cowering under trees by day. The air war had shifted decisively. Meanwhile, Patton drove his commanders mercilessly. He insisted on constant pressure, constant maneuver, constant attack. To him, momentum was everything. If the Germans were given even a few hours to regroup, they might form another strong defensive line. So he pushed and pushed and pushed again. When one of his corps commanders complained about exhaustion and supply shortages, Patton cut him off. "Fatigue makes cowards of us all," he snapped. "We'll rest when the Germans do, and not a minute before." He knew the German offensive was collapsing. He could smell blood in the snow. By January 8th, German command finally accepted the inevitable. Hitler ordered a withdrawal from the Ardennes, a retreat to the Siegfried Line. But it was too late. Their forces were battered, their vehicles lost, their morale shattered. American units closed the Bulge day by day. Villages such as Houffalize, Stavelot, and La Roche were retaken in a rising tide of Allied counterattacks. Patton's tanks smashed through roadblocks, his infantry stormed icy trenches, and his artillery pounded retreating German columns without mercy. On January 16th, the Northern and Southern Allied armies linked up at Houffalize. The Bulge was no more. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The cost was staggering. The Germans lost over 100,000 men, 700 tanks, and most of their remaining aircraft. It was an irrevocable blow to their war machine. Hitler had gambled everything and lost. The Americans, too, had paid dearly with nearly 80,000 casualties, but they had achieved something monumental. They had stopped the last major German offensive on the Western Front. And they had done it in the worst winter Europe had experienced in decades. As January faded into February, Patton surveyed the battlefield from his jeep. Burnt-out tanks half buried in snow, twisted gun barrels pointing at nothing, trees splintered by shellfire, and bodies, German and American, frozen where they fell. It was a graveyard of steel and ice. But it was also the graveyard of Hitler's last hope. Patton wrote to his wife shortly after the victory, "God saved me for this effort. I feel that deeply. The men have done magnificently, and the Germans have discovered that we Americans, when properly led, can and will fight. The Ardennes had proven it. The Germans had mocked. the Americans in the early days of the battle. They had laughed at the forces trapped in Bastogne. But the laughter had died in the snow. For the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge became not just a victory. It became a testament to resilience, leadership, and the unbreakable spirit of soldiers who refused to yield. The Bulge was gone. The road to Germany lay open. And the final chapter of the war in Europe was beginning. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with triumphal shouts, but with exhausted men standing in a silent, frozen world they had fought to reclaim. Through fire, ice, and impossible odds, American courage and leadership shattered Hitler's final gamble. Their sacrifice carved a path to victory and shaped the future of Europe. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful World War II tales, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe to keep history alive.